Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are stepping right into the center of a massive media storm. I'm talking about the release of the Jeffrey Epstein files. It is everywhere, it's overwhelming, and quite frankly, it's a lot to process.
It's a story that has just dominated headlines globally, and rightfully so.
Oh.
The scale of it is staggering. We're talking about a release that spans nearly 2 decades of litigation. It encompasses names that run the gamut from royalty to presidents to business titans.
It really is. But before we get lost in the sensational details, and believe me, there are plenty of those, I want to frame today's conversation a little differently. We know we have a lot of listeners who use this show to sharpen their English skills, for professional or academic contexts. So today, we're going to be very intentional. We're treating this whole news event as a masterclass in news English.
Which is such a necessary approach. When a story this complex breaks, the language used by journalists, lawyers, politicians, it shifts. It becomes very, very specific, almost architectural. It's about navigating these complex narratives and understanding the precise weight of certain words. If you don't get the nuance of a word like redaction or compliance in this context, you miss half the story.
Exactly. We are not here to gossip. We are here to decode. We want you to walk away understanding the narrative, but also mastering the high-level vocabulary that shapes it. And there's one word we have to start with, which came up again and again in our sources. Seismic?
Seismic, right? It's one borrowed from geology, earthquakes, the movement of tectonic plates. But in news English, we use seismic impacts to describe a political or social event that completely shifts the ground we stand on. It implies the landscape has changed permanently, and as we unpack these files, especially the fallout in the UK, you will see why that word is really the only one that fits.
The ground is definitely moving. So here's the plan. We're going to navigate through the sheer scale of this release, then move directly into that political earthquake hitting the UK. We'll actually pause for a comprehension check there, just to make sure we've all nailed the details. Then we'll break down the specific vocabulary used by the victims, the government, and business leaders.
It's a heavy list, but a necessary one. So let's get into the files themselves.
Let's start with just the volume. The BBC report we analyzed mentioned 3 million pages of documents. 3 million, plus 180,000 images and 2,000 videos. The sheer logistics of that are just mind-boggling.
It is overwhelming, but that volume leads us straight to our first key vocabulary term, compliance.
Right. Now, compliance usually sounds like boring office paperwork. Make sure you're in compliance with HR policies. But here it carries a different weight.
Much different. The U.S. Department of Justice didn't just dump these files because they wanted transparency or, because they felt like being helpful. They released them in compliance with the Court Act. Compliance simply means the act of following a rule, an order, or a law.
So it implies a lack of agency.
Precisely. It implies obligation. When the DOJ says they're acting in compliance, they're signaling we're doing this because we have to. It strips away the idea that this is some moral crusade on their part and frames it as a bureaucratic necessity. They were legally forced to produce these documents to comply with the court order.
That's a crucial distinction. They aren't the heroes here. They're the bureaucrats. Now, as these files came out, we started seeing responses from the powerful people named in them. And there's a specific word that keeps popping up in their denials. It's not, I don't remember. It's recollection.
Yes, this is classic legal English. For example, the sources mention Lord Peter Mandelson, a major UK politician who, well, we'll discuss him in depth shortly. The files show Epstein paid significant sums, around $75,000, into accounts linked to him. Mandelson's response: he stated he has no record or recollection of receiving the money.
To the average ear, that just sounds like, I forgot. But why not just say that? Why not just say, I forgot?
Because I forgot sounds careless or even worse, incompetent. I have no recollection is a formal defensive posture. It offers a layer of legal protection. It implies, if I did it, the memory is not currently accessible to me, so I cannot be accused of lying if evidence pops up later. It shifts the burden of proof entirely onto the accuser. It's a shield made of words.
Wow. That is fascinating. It's a way of denying without technically denying anything. Now, while the politicians are using these verbal shields, the nature of the crime described in the files is horrifying. The sources describe the abuse as being orchestrated by Epstein.
That is a very heavy, very intentional word choice. To orchestrate means to plan or manipulate something very carefully and often secretly. Think of a conductor leading an orchestra. Every instrument, every single note is controlled. Epstein wasn't just acting impulsively or opportunistically. He created a complex system, a web, to facilitate this abuse. Orchestrated implies a high level of intelligence applied to evil ends.
And that orchestrated web stretched all the way across the Atlantic. This brings us to the UK connection, which I think is where the seismic nature of this story really becomes clear.
Absolutely. While Epstein was American, the fallout is hitting London just as hard as New York. The sources describe it as a political earthquake in Westminster.
This part really surprised me. I assumed this was a U.S. story with maybe Prince Andrew involved, but it goes much, much deeper into the political machinery. At the center of this current storm is Lord Peter Mandelson.
Right. And for our listeners who might not follow UK politics closely, Mandelson isn't just some random politician. He was a titan in the Labour Party. He was the former UK ambassador to the US and the business secretary, a true architect of modern British politics.
And the allegations are specific. It's not just that he went to dinner with Epstein. The files suggest he might have passed market-sensitive material to him.
And that phrase is critical. Market sensitive.
What are we actually talking about here? Is this just gossip?
No, this is much more serious than gossip. Market sensitive refers to confidential information that, if it were made public, would change the price of stocks, currencies, or commodities. The allegation is that during the 2008 financial crisis, a time of global panic, Mandelson shared information about a Eurozone bailout and bank asset sales with Epstein.
So effectively, he's accused of giving a financier a heads up on global economic shifts before the public knew.
That is the implication. It suggests using state secrets for private advantage, and the consequences have been swift. The sources tell us that police have already started searches of his properties. He's been removed from the House of Lords, and he is out of the Labour Party.
That is a massive fall from grace. But here's the tricky part. Why does this matter for the current government? Keir Starmer, the current Labour leader, he isn't in the files, right?
No, Starmer isn't in the files, but in politics, you're judged by the company you keep, or in this case, the people you appointed. The fallout is hitting Starmer because it raises questions about his judgment. Why was Mandelson given such power? It creates instability. Some MPs are even worried this could shorten Starmer's leadership. It's a classic case of political contagion.
Okay, there are a lot of moving parts here, and the specific language regarding the UK crisis is really important for understanding the news reports coming out of London. I want to pause here and do a quick comprehension check.
I think that's a great idea. Let's test the retention of these specific details.
Okay, listeners, I'm going to ask you 3 questions based on the UK political situation we just discussed. I'll give you a moment to think about the answer, and then we'll reveal it. Try to recall the specific English terminology we used. Question 1. The files accuse Lord Mandelson of passing a specific type of information to Epstein during the 2008 financial crisis. What is the 2-word English phrase for that type of information?
The answer is market-sensitive material. Remember, this means info that can move stock prices.
Okay, question 2. As a legal consequence of these files, what specific action have the police taken regarding Lord Mandelson's physical assets?
The answer is police have started searches of 2 of his properties.
And finally, question 3. Even though he isn't named in the files, why is this situation considered a threat to the current Labour leader, Keir Starmer?
The answer is it raises questions about his judgment in appointing Mandelson, and it creates political instability that could shorten his time as leader.
How did you hopefully you caught those nuances. It really highlights how a document release in one country can cause a seismic event in another.
It does. And that chaos, it looks different depending on who you are. This brings us to our perspectives analysis.
This is a great way to understand the news. We often talk about the public reaction as if it's one big thing, but actually there are distinct groups reacting in very different ways, using very different vocabulary.
Correct. We're going to look at 3 groups: the victims, the UK government, and business leaders. And to keep this structured for our learners, we're going to summarize each perspective in exactly 3 sentences. This is a good exercise in synthesis, taking a lot of emotion and information and just boiling it down.
Let's start with the most important group, the victims or survivors. The vocabulary here is incredibly heavy. We saw the term bittersweet used by Amanda Roberts, the sister-in-law of Virginia Giuffre.
Bittersweet is such a poignant word. It combines bitter and sweet. It means a mixture of happiness and sadness, proud that the truth is finally out, but sad and exhausted that they have to relive it.
And their lawyers use the phrase irreparable harm.
That's a legal term. It means harm that cannot be fixed no matter how much money is paid or how many apologies are issued. Once your privacy is breached, you can't put the genie back in the bottle.
So, looking at the sources, let's summarize the victim's perspective.
Okay, here is the 3-sentence summary for the victims. 1. Victims feel a mix of satisfaction that the truth is finally out, but they also feel fear and anger because the release forces them to relive their trauma. 2. They have suffered irreparable harm because the Department of Justice accidentally failed to redact or hide the names of survivors who wanted to stay anonymous. 3. Ultimately, they are disappointed because they want accountability, meaning arrests and charges, not just a massive dump of old documents.
That distinction between truth and accountability is vital. They want justice, not just paperwork.
Okay, let's pivot to the second group, the UK government. They are in crisis mode.
Oh, they are. The key vocabulary here is vetting process and misconduct.
Vetting process is basically a background check, correct? Yes, but an intense one. It's the process of thoroughly examining someone before giving them a sensitive job. The question is, did the vetting process for Mandelson fail? And did his leaks constitute misconduct, which is bad behavior by a professional, specifically someone in public office?
Let's try the 3-sentence summary for the UK government.
Right, here is how the government sees it. 1. The government is facing a political earthquake. As the files suggest, high-ranking officials may have leaked sensitive state information during a financial crisis. 2. There is immense pressure to increase transparency, with Parliament voting to publish all communications regarding the vetting process of the former U.S. ambassador. 3. Officials are anxious that future document releases might reveal embarrassing private comments about U.S. relations or Donald Trump, causing further diplomatic damage.
So they're essentially in damage control, trying to stop the bleeding. Finally, let's look at the third group, business leaders. We're talking about big names like Bill Gates, Richard Branson, and others mentioned in the files.
The BBC business editor, Simon Jack, used a perfect phrase for this. He said the Epstein network had a corrosive effect.
Corrosive, like acid eating away at metal.
Exactly. It implies the damage wasn't instant, like an explosion. It was gradual, eating away at the integrity and reputation of everyone involved until the whole structure just collapsed.
Okay, let's summarize the business leader's perspective.
Here is the situation for them. 1. Business giants like Bill Gates and Richard Branson are expressing deep regret for their association with Epstein, claiming their interactions were limited or just a mistake. 2. The network, which was originally designed to trade favors and confer advantage, has instead become toxic, costing several high-profile executives their jobs. 3. The business community is shocked by the sheer scale of the web, realizing that involvement with Epstein is now a permanent stain on their professional reputations.
It really shows that no one escaped this unscathed. Corrosive is definitely the right word. Now, we can't talk about this scandal without addressing the royal aspect. It's unavoidable.
No, we can't. The files have been devastating for Prince Andrew. The sources are relentless.
The details are grim. There's the mention of a photo of him crouched on all fours, which just paints a disturbing picture. And then the emails from his ex-wife, Sarah Ferguson, calling Epstein the brother she never had.
It creates a picture of a very close, almost familial relationship, which directly contradicts his previous claims of being a distant acquaintance. But this brings up a massive challenge for us as news consumers and for the journalists reporting it. We need to talk about media literacy and the role of the BBC Verify team.
This is crucial because reporting on this is a minefield. One of the biggest hurdles they face involves a word we touched on earlier regarding the victims, redaction.
Yes, redaction. In a legal document, when you see those black bars covering text to protect privacy, that is redaction. It's a standard procedure.
But the problem here was the lack of redaction, wasn't it?
Precisely. The Department of Justice made significant redaction errors. They failed to cover the names of victims who were supposed to be anonymous. That is a massive procedural failure with real human costs. It highlights that even official releases can be flawed.
And on the flip side, there's also too much noise. The sources mentioned fake emails circulating supposedly from Elon Musk and fake photos.
This is why verifying sources is so vital. In a story this big, people will manufacture fake evidence for clicks or for political gain. You can't just read a tweet, you have to wait for the verified documents.
There's one more legal term that explains why, despite all these files, we aren't seeing handcuffs on new people right now. And that word is circumstantial.
This is so important for our listeners to understand. People look at the 3 million pages and ask, why aren't 10 more people in jail today? The answer is that much of the evidence is circumstantial.
How do you define that simply for someone who's not in law school?
Sure. Direct evidence proves a fact directly, like a video of a crime being committed. Circumstantial evidence implies a fact, but doesn't prove it directly. For example, proving Mandelson knew Epstein is a fact. Proving he gave him secret info specifically to commit a crime. That requires connecting dots that might not be fully visible yet.
So proximity to the crime isn't the same as committing the crime.
Exactly. And that makes prosecution incredibly difficult. Circumstantial evidence requires you to build a narrative that excludes all other possibilities, and that takes time.
That is a tough reality check. We have the smoke, but finding the smoking gun is a different legal standard.
Yeah.
We have covered a lot of ground today. Let's do a quick recap of that news English vocabulary before we go. If you want to sound like a pro when discussing current events, these are the words you need to own.
Let's run through them. We started with seismic, having a massive earthquake-like impact on society. Then, compliance following the rules or laws, often used to imply bureaucratic obligation. Recollection, the formal, legal word for memory, often used as a defensive shield. Market-sensitive information that moves the stock market, implying high value and confidentiality. Irreparable harm damage that cannot be fixed or undone. Accountability being held responsible for your actions, usually involving punishment. Vetting process, the rigorous background check for officials. And finally, corrosive effect, something that gradually destroys the integrity of everything it touches.
If you can use those 8 phrases correctly, you are well on your way to mastering political English.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up, I want to leave the listener with one final thought to mull over. It's about the difference between transparency and accountability.
How so?
We often conflate them. We think if we can see the files, we have justice. But this week has proven that just isn't true. We have transparency. We have 3 million pages of it. The victims, however, are still screaming for accountability for arrests.
That's a powerful distinction. Seeing the crime isn't the same as punishing it.
Exactly. Transparency is just the first step. So as you read the news this week, ask yourself, is this story generating noise, or is it generating justice? Because in the world of English news and in the real world, those are 2 very different things.
That is a heavy but important note to end on. Thank you for listening to The Deep Dive. We encourage you to go back, read the news snippets, and look for those specific words we discussed.
It's the best way to learn. See you next time.
Bye for now.
喜欢这种学习方式，欢迎订阅我的频道，让我们一起用下一个10分钟，把商业英文变简单。